I think this is about time to start. So I want to thank Melissa and the many, many, many others who helped put this great event together. I think it's so important and really, if nothing else, although many other things, just fun. So I'm very grateful to be here. So my name is Andy Stawasz. I'm a faculty fellow at the University of Michigan Law School. Before that, I was a clerk at the U.S. Court of Appeals for the 10th Circuit, an advisor at the White House Office of Information and Regulatory Affairs during the Biden-Harris administration. And of course, most importantly, I was a legal fellow at NYU Law's Institute for Policy Integrity. And before that, I was a student at Harvard Law School, where I was part of the inaugural cohort of Brooks Institute Emerging Scholar Fellows for aspiring animal law academics. It is really great to be back in this truly remarkable neighborhood that you all live in the West Village. So panel one gave insights into how particular near-term or present technologies affect particular animals' welfare and gave ideas on how to assess particular decisions concerning those technologies and those animals using tools like benefit-cost analysis. For this panel, we're going to zoom out a bit. We're going to look at some of the narratives and systems that underpin these conversations in the first place. We're going to look at some of the more frontier technological innovations that we may see affecting animals and the environment in the coming years. So to help us understand all of this, I am joined by an absolutely fabulous group of panelists. I'm going to introduce them all at once, and then I will let them offer their insights in the order that I introduce them. So first, to my immediate left is Nicole Negowetti. Nicole works at the intersections of food systems, health, democracy, and the polycrisis, using these as lenses to explore deeper questions about how we live together on a changing planet. Nicole's first book, Feeding the Future, Restoring the Planet and Healing Ourselves, was published by Georgetown University Press just recently. She previously served as a clinical instructor at the Harvard Animal Law and Policy Clinic from 2019 to 2021, where she taught an absolutely phenomenal group of students. Before that, she worked with the Food Law and Policy Clinic, the Good Food Institute, and the Valparaiso University School of Law, and she co-founded the Northwest Indiana Food Council. To her left, we have Elan Abrell. Professor Abrell is an assistant professor of science and technology studies, anthropology, and environmental studies at Wesleyan University. He's also the coordinator of the Animal Studies minor and previously served as the faculty coordinator of Environmental Justice and Sustainability. And before that, he was a farmed animal law and policy fellow at the Harvard Animal Law and Policy Program and a visiting assistant professor of anthropology and animal studies at One New York University. His research explores shifting patterns of human-animal interaction in the contemporary United States, with a specific focus on the ethical, ecological, and legal dimensions of animal care, and more recently, technological innovations in the alternative protein industry. Dr. Abrell's work has appeared in numerous edited volumes in peer-reviewed journals, and his book, Saving Animals, Multi-Species Ecologies of Rescue and Care, an ethnography of animal sanctuaries throughout the U.S., won the 2022 Gregory Bateson Book Prize from the Society for Cultural Anthropology. And then joining us by Zoom is Professor Hank Greely. Professor Greely is the Dean F. and Kate Edelman Johnson Professor of Law at Stanford Law School. He also serves as the director of the Center for Law and the Biosciences, Professor of Genetics by courtesy, the chair of the steering committee of the Center for Biomedical Ethics, and the director of the Stanford Program in Neuroscience and Society. He's also co-founded and led many projects and groups and served in very many roles in government and the private sector, far too many to name here. So now each panelist is going to give brief framing remarks. After that, we'll have plenty of time for follow-up questions. I may ask some of my own, but I would love to hear from you all, so start thinking about questions you may have for the panelists as they're speaking, and we'll use the same system as for panel one. With that, I welcome Nicole to take it away.
Thank you, Andy. Good afternoon. Thank you all for being here. I'm delighted to be part of this panel on this day. So I'd like to offer a bit of a different orientation and an invitation to sit with some deeper and often uncomfortable questions about how technology shapes the larger systems in which animals are bred, managed, raised, and replaced. This broader perspective helps situate the specific innovations that we've already heard about and that we'll continue to hear about from my fellow panelists within the institutional and economic context that influence the effects of these technologies. So as we all know, developments like cultured meat, plant-based proteins, genetic tools, and the AI systems that we've just learned about are beginning to emerge as new strategies and new ways of addressing the harms associated with industrial animal agriculture. But their significance extends beyond the direct outcomes of these technologies. They also influence habits, expectations, and shared understandings of what becomes normal in our culture, oftentimes in unexpected and in unintended ways. So the inquiry I'd like to explore concerns how tools influence relationships, including how humans relate to other animals and how they participate in shaping the worlds that we come to inhabit. Modern industrial systems operate with a familiar logic and set of priorities: scaling up production, improving efficiency, solving problems through technological optimization, and planning for continued growth. We see this in industrial animal agriculture and throughout society. And in this context, scale comes to signify success, and efficiency signifies responsibility. Across food technologies, and sometimes even within animal law reforms, moral concerns are reframed as challenges that can be solved with technology. So once you have this framing in mind, then the pathway becomes clear. It means that we need more control, more precision, more efficiency. This orientation understands humans primarily as managers over living systems instead of participants within them. Within this framework, technological capability is often treated as a sufficient reason for its deployment. So in practice, that means that once something becomes possible, it is treated as self-evident, or said more plainly, there's a belief that if humans can do it, then we should move on in deploying the technology. Yet technologies never arise in isolation. They are part of an innovation ecosystem shaped by funding priorities, institutional structures, and market incentives, and they reshape all of those in turn. So consider the plow, a very basic tool, a very basic technology. So it increased productivity and enabled surplus production. It enabled the growth of civilization. It also reshaped landscapes and social organization. Fields were cleared, forests were destroyed, soils were repeatedly turned, communities became more sedentary. Land was increasingly treated as something to be worked intensely rather than lived within. And the plow, importantly for our discussion, involved animal traction. As animals were harnessed and beaten all day to pull the plow, their role shifted, and so did humans' perception of those animals. They were no longer primarily companions in shared ecological systems or beings with spiritual significance in many animist traditions. Instead, they became sources of labor, beasts of burden, integral to the productive capacity of the farm. And over time, this shifted to a broader orientation. Land was increasingly understood as something to be improved and extracted from. Animals were incorporated as working inputs. Yield became the key measure of success. Scaling production became both possible, desirable, if not the ultimate goal. And here we are today. The plow did not create these shifts on its own. It's not just the technology itself, but it did make those patterns easier and more entrenched. Today's food technologies can shape relationships in very similar ways. For example, automated livestock systems that Jeff spoke about, whether that's for milking or feeding or herding animals, they have shifted how farmers interact with animals, translating well-being into metrics and production data rather than direct observation and contact. Genetic interventions can redirect attention from an animal's well-being and living conditions to its biological traits. And alternative proteins can either maintain familiar animal-based meal structures or can support totally different dietary patterns. In each case, the tool or technology influences what people notice, what they rely on, and how they understand their role in relation to animals and the ecosystems. Some technologies make it easier to question existing practices, but others make it easier to continue in an updated form. A dynamic known as Jevons paradox helps to illustrate this. When efficiency increases, total consumption often rises rather than falls. In practice, efficiency can reduce suffering per unit or per body, but it still can increase overall scale. We see this today in biogas digesters, which are intended to improve the efficiency of farms, of factory farms. That can incentivize larger herds, and in fact it does. Chicken, which has been considered a more sustainable protein, consumption of it has surged without displacing other meats. Alternative proteins often complement industrial meat production rather than replacing it. Industrial systems that are based on growth and efficiency are very adept at absorbing reform and translating those efficiency gains into expansion. This points beyond individual technologies to the growth assumptions in which they operate. And this pattern can extend to animal bodies themselves. So there are some proposals to modify or disenhance animals to reduce their suffering in crowded environments, for example, genetically engineering blind chickens so that they don't realize that they're in crowded environments. And technologies that prevent male chick culling also can reduce visible harm. These approaches, they can reduce suffering in specific ways, and I don't mean to minimize that at all, but they can also adapt the animals to the existing systems rather than prompting total reconsideration of those systems themselves. And so in this way, welfare improvements can coexist with deeper structural continuity and entrenchment. So because technologies develop within those innovation ecosystems of financing, ownership, governance, and regulation, evaluating them involves examining how they interact with incentives, institutions, and cultural practices. So there are existing approaches, and as humans, we can certainly develop new approaches. But one to name here is the EU's Responsible Research and Innovation, which encourages early reflection and inclusion of diverse perspectives before deployment of a technology. So it asks questions such as, who benefits from these technologies? What dependencies arise? Which ways of living and working are supported or displaced? Attending to these different dimensions, which are so often ignored, supports more responsive and responsible innovation and tech deployment. So alongside the technological optimism that we see in our culture, we are also living through what I call threshold times, through economic and institutional strain and cultural polarization. In these times of deep uncertainty, societies often gravitate towards tools and leaders who can promise stability and control. Technological management can appear to offer predictability by optimizing processes and reducing risk. And at the same time, cultural responses tend to assert familiar hierarchies, as we are seeing with the cultural backlash against plant-based eating and calls for a renewed emphasis on meat consumption as being natural, desirable, even necessary. That's often tied to identity, tradition, masculinity, autonomy, and sovereignty. So these different responses to uncertainty, they both seek to manage complexity without fundamentally reconsidering how humans understand their place in the world. And under these threshold conditions, the technologies are more likely to be deployed functionally to preserve existing systems, even when their underlying capability is transformative. Animal law often operates within these same dynamics. Animals that are farmed remain economically central, culturally normalized, and legally classified as commodities. Much of animal law focuses on mitigating harm within systems that are structured around scale efficiency and growth. And in this way, law can mirror the same logics and assumptions that guide technological development. Tech reshapes relationships in practice. Law gives those relationships structure and legitimacy. And in those ways, they can make particular forms of animal use appear normal and enduring. So the question for animal law for this field, I think, is whether our goal is to improve existing systems or to reconsider the relationships that sustain them and make those systems possible. So the plow reshaped human relationships to land. Industrial agriculture continues to reshape our relationships to other animals. And the emerging technologies that we've been talking about and will continue talking about today will influence the next chapter. So I offer as a guiding inquiry, what forms of relationships and what qualities of relationships do our tools make more likely? Because the technologies that we advocate for and that we advance shape the world we come to inhabit. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for putting this event together. Thank you everyone for being here. It's really a pleasure and an honor. I should say really quickly, apologies in advance if I stumble or I'm a little slow-witted. I'm pretty jet-lagged from a delayed trip because of the blizzard. But I wanted to say a couple things as a preface before I get into the paper. One, you'll see in a minute that although Nicole and I didn't coordinate at all, I couldn't ask for a better paper to follow because that set up a lot of really important ideas that I'm going to look at sort of a more specific case that ties into the argument that Nicole was just making. And that's one about what I'm going to call cultured meat. You probably have heard about this before. It goes under news coverage. It's usually called lab-grown meat. It's a cell-cultured meat, craft meat, tank meat. It's one of my favorite ones, although that's a little pejorative. But it's essentially a product that's barely available for sale almost anywhere in the world, just a couple restaurants and a meat shop in Singapore. But the company's been working on it for over 10 years now to use tissue culturing technology taken from the biomedical field to grow animal flesh in what's called bioreactors so that they can create food products that are literally animal meat, not some kind of plant-based alternative, but without having to kill animals. So what I'm going to say is pretty critical of that industry or that project. But I do want to say to start, just to be clear, like I think if it existed, it would be much better than the system we have now. So I'm not trying to say that the technology itself is necessarily bad, but I'm criticizing more of the project of creating it. So the story of the cultured meat industry is often told as one of scientific advancement, specifically a techno-utopian narrative that frames cellular agriculture as the premier solution to the ethical and environmental devastation caused by industrial animal farming. This narrative, championed by cultured meat advocates and fueled by over $3 billion in private investments to various startups, some of which have now gone out of business, suggests that global meat consumption is a static reality that can only be addressed through technological substitution rather than sociocultural change. However, I argue that this framing relies on a narrow technological imagination that substitutes speculative innovation for the structural transformation required to effectively protect animals and the planet. So at the heart of the cultured meat industry is a political economic logic based on what sociologists have called solutionism. So as defined by science historian Evgeny Morozov and geographer Julie Gutman, solutionism occurs when proponents reach for an answer, in this case a technological one, before the underlying questions have been fully investigated. In the cultured meat sector, the problem is framed as the inefficiency or suffering inherent in the animal's body, actually both, rather than the capitalist system of exploitation that produces those bodies. So this framing serves a powerful persuasive function. It allows investors and the public to imagine a future where they can have their meat and eat it too, without sacrificing the comforts of modern consumption. By positioning cellular agriculture as a capitalist techno-fix, the industry attempts to circumvent the messy world of politics that would require challenging corporate power or shifting dietary habits. Think about the reaction to the Green New Deal, which I don't think even suggested getting rid of hamburgers, but was immediately denounced by the right wing as an effort to take away everybody's hamburgers. So this strategy has successfully reconfigured the financial landscape of animal advocacy more broadly over the last decade and a half or so, channeling millions of dollars away from traditional outreach and toward venture capitalist startups. The persuasive power of the cultured meat narrative often obscures stark technological and economic limitations. Detailed techno-economic analyses, or shorthand TEAs, such as one really prominent one commissioned by the nonprofit foundation Open Philanthropy and conducted by David Humbert in 2020, suggests that the industry's promises of cost parity with conventional meat are largely illusory. For instance, at a production scale of 100 kilotons of meat per year, a single cell slurry, and it doesn't sound very appetizing, but the technology basically makes, it doesn't make complex muscle tissue right now. So the outcome is essentially something like ground meat, whether it goes in chicken nuggets or hamburgers or sausages or whatever. It's just a loose collection of cells. So this product of 30% animal cells and 70% water, which would be suitable only for nuggets or burgers, would likely cost around $40 per pound at the grocery store, or $100 for a restaurant quarter pounder. More recently, this is sort of the price for what's being sold right now. One of the two main companies that have already been approved by the FDA for selling their products is Eat Just, and they make a chicken product that's sold in Singapore. Essentially, it's 3% cultured meat and 97% vegetable protein to make a kind of chicken meat product that's still 7 times the cost of the regular conventional chicken that's being sold in the same store in Singapore. So the scale required to displace conventional animal agriculture is equally daunting. According to a much more optimistic technological or economic analysis that was commissioned by the Good Food Institute and that they put forward as much more reliable or representative of the progress of the industry, it still found that produced just 0.02% of the 100 billion pounds of meat produced annually in the US, a single facility would still require high-grade bioreactor volume equal to nearly 1/3 of the entire global biopharmaceutical industry's current capacity, so way outside of what exists. Humbert found that the industry would need a massive infusion of funding well beyond the $3 billion already invested, mostly from private investment or corporate investment, to have any impact on shifting consumption practices by 2030. So even if price parity with conventional meat could be achieved by 2030, which doesn't seem likely, the amount of meat being produced would be nowhere near enough to supplant conventional meat in time to slow any kind of catastrophic global warming, which is one of the main, I think, most imperative reasons to end industrial animal farming, as it contributes around 14 or 15% to global greenhouse gas emissions. And although this seems very unlikely for many reasons, we should be trying as hard as possible to get down to zero emissions as quickly as possible. So far from disrupting the power of big meat, the cultured meat sector extends the logics of industrialization and corporate concentration. Many of the most prominent startups are financially supported by the very meatpacking conglomerates they claim to challenge, such as Tyson, JBS, and Cargill. These incumbents have positioned themselves as protein companies, although they're sort of dropping this and going back to being big meat. But for a while, they were calling themselves protein companies, and they were using venture capital to hedge their bets and expand into new sectors while remaining heavily invested in conventional livestock production. Furthermore, the industry's reliance on intellectual property and trade secrets creates a fundamental contradiction, because for-profit firms must protect their patented methodologies to ensure a return for investors. They can't pool resources to accelerate innovation. They could under a very different production model, but that's not what they're doing as for-profit venture capital companies. So the secrecy that comes with this makes the industry prone to exaggeration. For example, an expose published by Wired magazine in 2023 revealed that Upside Foods, the other main cultured meat company that's been approved by the FDA and the other most wealthy company as far as capital investment, allegedly misrepresented its ability to produce whole cuts of meat, leading employees to joke that the company might be the next Theranos. This model of innovation reinforces a food system where production is consolidated under a few powerful actors, minimizing the possibility of a more democratic or decentralized agricultural economy. By focusing on a technological fix, industry discourse channels resources away from potentially transformative approaches to reducing harm. Geographer Julie Gutman, who I mentioned earlier, distinguishes between the solution, which asks, what can I profit from, and a response, which asks, what does this situation need? A response would acknowledge that the current crisis stems from structural inequality, capitalism, and colonialism, and would thus seek to change society rather than just the product on the plate. The preoccupation with cultured meat renders invisible the political struggles, labor conditions, and multi-species relationships at the core of our food system. It treats the harms of industrial animal farming as engineering puzzles to be solved by patent-clutching geniuses, when what is needed are approaches that recognize the need for a more radical and immediate transformation of the global food system. By treating ethical considerations as something to be taken off the table through technology, the movement against industrial animal farming risks squandering activist resources that could be directed towards immediate sociocultural and/or political economic shifts in consumption policy. Ultimately, rather than helping transform the food system, cultured meat, or the promise of cultured meat, since it doesn't really exist on the market, helps to obscure reality that technology cannot facilitate the political, economic, and sociocultural transformation that's needed. While cultured meat is preferable to the slaughter of animals, its current manifestation as a venture capital-driven commodity ensures it will likely remain a market niche for wealthy consumers if it continues to be produced at all. So for example, the people who can afford to buy the cultured chicken at the Singapore specialty store, rather than a systemic replacement for factory farming. For animal law and advocacy to be effective, it must engage critically with these emerging technologies, ensuring they don't merely reproduce the same power structures that created the need for intervention in the first place. The empty promises of the industry serve as a cautionary tale. Saving animals and the planet requires more than a capitalist techno-fix. It requires a commitment to the messy world of politics and a fundamental rethinking of our relationship with the living world.
All right. Well, now for something completely different. Can you hear me? Good. So I am an animal and I am a law person, but I'm not an animal law person. I work on law and biosciences pretty broadly. And I think that the bioscience background is in part why I want to talk not just about animals in the context of food, but also in the context of research subjects or objects, or I won't say participants particularly. So I want to talk about both of those things. I think there are some interesting technological possibilities that are interesting in and of themselves, but in some respects, they're more interesting because they raise tough questions about what we do know, what we can know, and really what we care about, as well as the eternal question. Whenever anybody poses a question about anything, you always have to ask, who do you mean by the we? So I want to do two things. I want to talk about animal parts, and I want to talk about whole animals. So animal parts, and this would include things like the cultured meat industry. The one that is most interesting right now with respect to research uses are things called organoids. Organoids are very small, about the size of a peppercorn, of a black peppercorn, uh, hollow spheres of cells. And it turns out that you can make organoids that are made from the cells of the gut, or the cells of the heart, or the cells of the uterus, or the cells of the brain. And people are very excited about the possible uses of human organoids in research to replace animal research. Instead of studying new drugs on animals, you study drugs on human organoids. There is a lot of interest in this. There's a lot of interest in it in the current NIH. Of the many really fascinating questions with the current administration, you have to wonder of the vastly disparate coalition of bodies that go into the Trump movement, who will win out right now. But there is a lot of pro-animal welfare interest in parts of NIH, including the newly named deputy director of NIH. So the idea of reducing the use of animals and animal suffering in research is a big deal. Organoids certainly can play a role in that. How big a role is going to be a real question, because of extrapolating, it's hard enough to extrapolate from a rat to a human, to extrapolate from a tiny little several millimeter ball of cells to a whole human organism is tricky. There are things that you clearly can do. My friend and colleague at Stanford, Sergiu Pașca, has done some really interesting work with human brain organoids to see how human brain tissues react to different kinds of infections, like Zika virus infection. And he thinks this has led to some ideas about why Zika virus infection in pregnant women sometimes leads to microcephaly, to children born with very small brains or very small heads. There's something that can be done. How much can be done isn't clear, and that'll take a lot of work to figure out, a lot of difficult work to figure out. But NIH has set up a Center for Organoid Systems that is intended to try to move organoids into research, and by so doing, displace at least some of the hundreds of millions of animals, mainly rodents, that get used in research every year. For some systems, that'll be easier, like organoids about bladders. Bladders are pretty simple. Organoids about brains. Brains are extraordinarily complicated. So the scientific ability to do this is going to vary depending on what organ system you're looking at. But there's also a deeper question that's already been raised, at least with respect to the brain organoids. Nobody's very worried about the consciousness or sentience of gut organoids. But what if brain organoids feel pain? What if brain organoids are conscious? What if brain organoids turn out to be Gregor Samsa, who wakes up one morning and discovers that he's in the body of a giant cockroach and says, "What am I doing here?" Now, the scientists tend to take these concerns not very seriously, because these brain organoids are tiny at this point, and it seems highly, highly unlikely that right now, at least, any kinds of consciousness, sentience, etc., could exist. But they're getting bigger, they're getting more complicated. People are putting them together into assembloids. And at some point, it might be that the organoids might actually feel pain. Then what do we do? Well, we do research on rats and mice that has them feel pain, but at least that research is regulated. Organoids aren't animals for purposes of regulation. They're not people for purposes of regulation. They're not anything for purposes of regulation. And then there's a deeper question still, how would we even know if they were consciousness or could feel pain? They can't tell us. And so I think the organoids give a nice example of some of the uncertainties here. One can move past organoids. One can imagine growing entire hearts, entire livers, not out of animal tissue, but out of human tissue, and using these human livers created outside of humans as test sites, and reducing the use of animals. Presumably, they would be closer to human results, except moving from an isolated organ to an entire human system raises deep scientific questions. What about whole bodies, whole animals? It is entirely conceivable that one could make animals that could not feel pain. We know of rare circumstances of humans who do not feel pain. They have rare genetic variations that causes them to not feel pain. These, by the way, sound like they would be wonderful. They turn out to be actually terrible conditions to have, leading to short life expectancy. If you don't realize that it hurts to have your foot in the fire or to have your foot hit by something, bad things happen. But one can imagine doing it in animals so that the animals are pain-free. There's a scientific question there. If you're doing research on animals that are pain-free, are their reactions similar to those of humans who would not be pain-free, or does the pain affect how well the drug functions, or various reactions of the body to it in ways that mean that influence what you're trying to discover about the drug? We don't know. There's another question: is pain the same as suffering? Maybe you don't feel physical pain, but is it possible that you're still feeling some sort of suffering, and how would you know that? But these are things that are at least being discussed as pain-free animals. And this raises still a different question as well, and that is what we care about with respect to animals just their pain, or just their suffering, or just their pain and suffering? Or is it something more basic about the relationship of humanity, of human animals to non-human animals, and the respect or treatment that is owed to other animals? Those are good questions. An animal model that might be particularly attractive is actually humans who have human bodies that have been declared dead by neurological criteria, so-called brain dead bodies, that where the body is kept alive. Physiologically, this has been done. It can last for 30 years. Recently, these have been used for research. Does that make sense? And what concerns should we have about that? And then finally, there are some people who are interested in making what they call bodyoids. There is an article that I was a co-author on in the MIT Tech Review about bodyoids. The main scientist is a guy at Stanford named Hiro Nakauchi. And Hiro's idea is to make animals that, sort of varies depending on how excited he is about what he thinks he can do. Animals that have no heads, animals that have no brains, animals that have brains but have no consciousness, no possibility for consciousness, that could be used for research subjects. But here we get back into the food side, that could be used for food. And then what do you do? What are we concerned about making animals and using animals if they can't feel pain and can't suffer because they have no consciousness? A whole bunch of scientific questions about whether such things could even survive, live, thrive, etc. But if they could, what should the appropriate animal law or animal rights view be with respect to those things, those animals that have no consciousness? Hiro has even taken the idea farther and talked about human bodyoids. Oh, and the animals with no consciousness could be used both for research purposes and for food purposes. Human bodyoids, human bodies without brains or without heads, could be used not only as research subjects, in that sense, kind of akin to brain dead people as research subjects, but could be used as organ, quote, donors, close quote. Although never has the word donor seemed quite so inappropriate when you're talking about a donation from somebody who has no consciousness or no brain. What would we think about that? So these are some of the techno fixes that have been proposed. I think they raise really interesting questions that are both scientific questions, but maybe more importantly and more deeply, questions about what we care about, leaving aside for a moment the question of who the we is, or what should be cared about, either with respect to non-human animals or with respect to human animals. And then I haven't overlapped much with the first two speakers, but I will say one general observation from 73 years of watching things. Culture always changes. Controlling culture change is really, getting culture to change in ways you want is really difficult and really hard to do. I think part of the attraction of techno fixes is as hard as they may be, they often turn out to be easier than controlling cultural changes in directions you want them to go. American culture has changed dramatically since the end of the Obama administration, but not in ways I would have predicted or in ways that I have liked. So I will end there and look forward to our discussion.
So thank you to all the panelists. I thought that was all really fabulous. Great insights, a lot to chew on. There was only one thing that I strongly disagreed with, which was Professor Greely saying he's not an animal law person. I thought that was a great set of questions from an animal law perspective. And also, I take it all law is in some sense animal law, both because a lot of law affects non-human animals in ways we sometimes appreciate, sometimes don't. For example, for administrative law friends like me, Loper Bright was an animal law case, et cetera, Lujan, we could go on. And because, of course, all law is definitionally animal law, just most of it focused on one species. So we have plenty of time now for questions from the audience, comments, observations. I see Jeff. Reminder for folks to use the mics and to turn them on.
Great. Thank you so much for this panel. I have a question for Elan. Thank you so much for your remarks. I agree with what you said about cultivated meat. I wanted to invite you to say a little bit more. I found myself thinking I could read the takeaway in stronger or weaker terms, and I wanted to see where you land on that spectrum. So, for example, a strong interpretation might be we should not frame cultivated meat research and development as at all part of a portfolio of possible solutions, and we should bring the investments down to zero and invest entirely in other strategies for food system transformation and animal liberation, et cetera. A weaker reading might be the messaging is a bit off, the resource allocations are a bit off, we need to bring nuance. So for example, we should avoid saying that cultivated meat is a silver bullet solution that can single-handedly solve the problem, but we should give a nod to it as worthy of investment as part of the portfolio. And we should avoid bringing resource allocation up to 100%, but it should still be, maybe a little lower than it is now, but somewhere where it is now. So basically, I was curious where between that stronger and that weaker interpretation of the takeaway you land in your own analysis.
Thanks, Jeff. I was hoping and counting on you pushing back on cultured meat stuff. I think that as a project of capital, it won't achieve anything that it's being put forward as achieving, and it's mostly because there isn't enough capital investment to get the technology there fast enough. And by saying fast enough, I'm thinking in terms of really catastrophic impacts from climate change. Of course, ending industrial animal farming alone won't be enough to stop those things from happening anyway. So I'm not suggesting that this was the only factor to consider in the first place, but I think that there should be a lot of government investment in it. I don't think that the technology is not valuable. I think people not only want to eat meat, but that our global capitalist society is built in a way that labor requires meat for reproduction. Cheap animal products are what most people live off of and get their nutrients from to some extent. So in that regard, we need to find a way to replace it. I don't think the solution tomorrow is banning it and telling everybody not to eat it anymore. I don't think that's going to happen. But I just don't see the way that it's been positioned as a project of animal advocacy, and a lot of the focus and attention and resources shifted towards that. Maybe 15 years ago, it was vegan advocacy, and there are a lot of criticisms of that not working also. So I'm not saying that we should necessarily go back to vegan advocacy, but I don't think it's been the best use of animal activist resources to focus on essentially enriching one section of the tech industry in Silicon Valley, which doesn't seem like it's going to actually materialize into the kind of change we wanted to accomplish. So I don't know where that put me on maybe in the middle. I don't think that I don't see it as working as a part of the strategy, but I also don't condemn the idea of developing the technology.
Not seeing any other immediate hands, though. Start thinking if folks have questions. I might ask Nicole a question that's sort of broadly along similar lines. So you talk, I think quite rightly, about how our ethics, relationships, and epistemic assumptions shape our decisions regarding technology. And you talk about the converse, how technological change affects our ethics, relationships, and epistemic assumptions. I thought the example of the plow was quite powerful in that, showing that causal arrow. And your story seems to be, tell me if I'm wrong, that these sort of interactions often work to more deeply entrench existing harmful systems and structures. I just wonder whether you see a causal arrow pointing maybe in a more optimistic direction sometimes under some conditions, and if so, what those conditions are. So, for example, we can imagine a world in which some technology, it may or may not be cultivated meat, enables cheap, delicious, accessible substitutes that are culturally appropriate, et cetera, for animal products. And we can imagine those substitutes in turn reducing meat eating and thereby reducing the cognitive dissonance many people experience when they eat meat. Like, I generally like animals, but I'm going to sort of turn that part of my brain off while I eat meat or something like that. Or I'm going to treat farmed animals differently, et cetera. So do you see a role for technology in shaping attitudes in a sort of beneficial direction and in turn shaping systems in a more beneficial, maybe less speciesist direction, something like that, in addition to the critiques you quite rightly level about some of this? And if so, how should that inform these sorts of conversations and decisions?
Yes, I do see the causal arrow going in both directions. And I don't think you mentioned in my bio, but I did spend over 3 years working for the Plant-Based Foods Association as the policy director and trying to promote these technologies. And so, yes, to resolve what you're describing as the meat paradox, this dissonance that people feel, they like meat, they want to eat meat, but they love animals, and they feel that tension. So I think there can be a role for those plant-based or maybe cultured meat alternatives to help ease that tension. But again, I feel like my role is inviting these more troubling questions. How does that tension evolve over time? I think for me personally, in my own vegan journey, it was feeling that dissonance and sitting with it long enough for it to work on me to say, I can't, it's not aligned. Eating meat is not aligned with my values. So but for some people, those plant-based alternatives can serve as a bridge, right? So that's kind of the thinking in that space, that people will go for the plant-based chicken nuggets or the burgers. They will realize that eating animals is not necessary. And so then that will begin to expand their circle of compassion. But it can also serve as a buffer, right? Blocking those more difficult questions. And people saying, I eat plant-based chicken nuggets, but I eat other chicken nuggets, it doesn't matter, right? And then you don't have to confront those difficult questions. I think the form matters, right? Going back to my earlier remarks and how I talked about what is being normalized and how then the law kind of formalizes, legitimizes those relationships. So if what's on offer are chicken nuggets and burgers and milk, we are still then saying that it's normal, if not necessary and desirable, to have as the reference point or the template animal bodies and secretions, right? So in other words, we are continuing to justify and normalize that as the center of the plate or a critical component of plant-based eating. I see that, even last night trying to figure out where to go. And the vegan restaurants, they had on offer lamb and chicken and, so again, I would want to invite a conversation which I have not been part of, even having spent a lot of my career in that space of plant-based and cultured alternatives. To question those pathways that we're on and what does it legitimize? And when can we incorporate reflexivity into the conversation to say whether it's about cultured meat and the enormous amount of investment that has gone into it, or in the plant-based space to say, maybe this is not working. Can we ask ourselves and have an honest conversation in the movement or with other stakeholders? Or is it, the sunk cost fallacy that we're just going to keep going? I'm not seeing that happen. So I don't want, you asked for an optimistic view. So it's plausible that we can move in the right direction, but I also want to invite a different perspective for the movement to think of itself as an ecology of responses. So this kind of goes to what you were saying, that yes, these alternatives can be a part of helping to shift culture, recognizing that we can't control it, but we can shape it. But how do we use the litigation and the public education and the legislative reform and all the tools that we have at our disposal to mutually enforce and reinforce each other so that we are not just competing with strategies, whether it's a techno fix or just focusing on litigation, but that those can work synergistically. I think that's the best chance we have to do what we're aiming to do.
Great. No, that's great. Yes, please.
So I'd heard something that sounded like quite a bit of confidence that these techno fixes would not in fact be fixes, and it would, we need some entirely different system to be the thing to do it. So I'm thinking to the example of the plow, which did turn animals into beasts of burden, but towards the end of the time that the plow played an important role on Earth, around the 1890s, there were attempts to find other ways of creating a non-animal based plow. There was an attempt to do it by wind power, and these were thought at the time as being crazy techno-utopian methodologies. And so then the automobile comes around, and more or less every plow that exists on the planet in industrialized farming is, of course, not pulled by an animal. So where does this confidence come from? That unlike almost every other large-scale change that we see in the way that the world works, that this one will be the one that resists it.
Well, I think you have to look at every situation on a case-by-case basis. So there's going to be different historical trajectories for different technology, but I would argue in the case of the plow, it didn't make things better. It removed animals from the equation, but it also added a lot more greenhouse gases accumulating over the last century. So I think that there are ways in which, for cultured meat, I don't think that the resources are there to get over the technological hurdles that exist for it to play the role that it's being positioned to play right now, at least not on a short time span. But I think you have to ask questions about any one of these kinds of technologies is what comes with it. Like Nicole mentioned, what was the paradox called? Where the efficiency causes Jevons paradox. There's a sociologist named Richard York who writes about this on some specific cases, and one of the papers he wrote was about the whaling industry. And an early argument for people arguing for cultured meat or cultivated meat was that it is sort of like the whaling industry. Once we do this, we don't have to. Once petroleum was discovered, they didn't have to harvest whales anymore. They could just use petroleum. But in fact, what happened was petroleum accelerated the harvesting of whales because it created faster boats and mechanical harpoons. And the only reason whaling ended for commercial species is because they were hunted to the point of extinction. And they just found new markets for the product. So they just were selling whale meat as dog food instead of as oil or whatever. And so you have to look at how the technological shift is going to, all the repercussions that it's going to have. Even if it were to replace a thing, it doesn't necessarily lead to a better outcome.
So I love that question, and I'd never thought about the internal combustion engine, the source of many terrible things, actually relieved an enormous amount of suffering of one particular species of animal, the horse. And 130 years ago, New York City would have been full of horses and full of horse shit and full of horses that were being abused and harmed, and terrible things were happening. The automobile has not only greatly increased greenhouse gas emissions, but kills 45,000 humans every year in the United States and does all sorts of terrible stuff. But it is a techno fix that worked with respect to horse use as beasts of burden. I think that it is not clear to me how well any of the techno fixes would work. But I think some of them, including the cultured meat industry And as weird as it is, sort of the bodyoid idea of rather than trying to build meat from cells alone, build meat from animal bodies that didn't have animal consciousness, animal souls, animal whatever you want to think about it as, might end up working. I think it's probably worth exploring, although it does raise really hard questions, I think, about what is it that one cares about with respect to the treatment of animals, and would a consciousness-less animal, if such a thing could be created, would that be a wonderful thing, or would that be an abomination, or somewhere in between? So a problem with technofixes is knowing where they're going to go. And I'm going to cite another dilemma, the Collingridge dilemma. Anybody ever hear of the Collingridge dilemma? This is a great regulatory dilemma. This actually, it's an engineer named Collingridge who about 40 years ago came up with this. And it's a dilemma about regulation. The easiest time to regulate a new technology is before it's become widespread. Once it becomes widespread, you've got vested interests that are going to try to support it, and it gets really hard. The hardest time to regulate a new technology is before it becomes widespread because you don't know what it's going to do. You don't have, even if you know what it does in the lab or in various limited circumstances, you don't know how it's going to change the world. And that's what you really want to regulate. And so if you regulate too soon, you may be regulating the wrong stuff. If you regulate too late, if you leave regulation too late, you may not be able to pull it off because the vested interests are going to make it too difficult. And so that's another variable to throw into the great difficulties of trying to plan the future. I am not opposed to trying to plan the future. But I am skeptical. I think we always need to keep in mind just how hard it is. It is always easy to predict the future. It's really hard to be right.
Please.
Excuse me if this is a confusing question because it's confusing for me too, but hopefully you guys can clarify a little bit. But I just wanted, I guess, to ask in what ways that you guys think these technologies could shift power relations between humans as well as between humans and animals, because a lot of our history has been subjugating animals and then comparing some, races to animals, for example, and creating some sort of human hierarchy, and using that as a justification to, I don't know, treat people badly, obviously. And human rights law has addressed that a little bit. But with the introduction of these types of technologies, which are at their foundation about, manipulating DNA, is there literature, I guess, within your fields that talks about how that can also be, can also be another danger here, and that, like, if we're developing this kind of technology, it could also be used on humans, right? And it has been in the past. Like, the medical industry is famous for this, like doing testing on humans without their knowledge. And could that also be, like, because we have, stakeholders in this conversation that aren't a part of it. Obviously, we're very privileged to be in this space and talking about these things, but there are a lot of people who could affect that aren't in this conversation, right? And so we have animals that are also unable to voice, the potential harms to them as stakeholders, but also humans. And I don't even know what the question is here, but could you talk about that a little bit?
There is a huge literature and a huge field, often goes by the acronym ELSI, Ethical, Legal, and Social Issues or Implications of genetics, of stem cell research, of a whole bunch of biotechnologies. Much of bioethics has been devoted to it. It's been a subject of discussion for a long, long time. And in fact, the drivers for these technologies have not so much been, well, the drivers for discussion and for funding of these technologies have not so much been non-human animals, but human animals. People are interested in them for their direct effects on human animals, mainly on avoiding, curing, preventing diseases in humans. So yes, you are right. There are enormous implications for all these biotech innovations with respect to humans, human bodies, human cultures, human minds. You could take 3 years of coursework on it and get a PhD, but there's a lot out there. And it's fascinating, and that's much of what I do, and so I highly recommend it.
A lot more to say, and with apologies for those who didn't get to ask any questions or comment, I want to really thank the fabulous panelists for such a robust discussion about such important topics.
Thank you for the moderator. It's just fantastic moderation.